So welcome everyone. It's such a pleasure for us all to be able to feast at the table that is DESIGN Canberra. It's fantastic that it's for professionals and aficionados alike. There's no differentiation there. And the DESIGN Canberra team have really pushed the boat out on this event. It was a keynote event. And they've really pushed the boat out in not only recognising that Michael Dysart needs to come and address us, but also that a special film has been procured for this, and tonight is the world premiere of that film. So our focus tonight is, of course, Michael Dysart and the world premiere of the short film by Tim Ross. And just to touch on the format for this evening, after my introduction, we'll play the film. Then Michael will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we have the opportunity for questions from the audience. We'll have roving microphones. And so now to Michael, and anyone with a even passing interest in Canberra and mid-century architecture, they know of Michael Dysart's signature works at Urambi Village and Wybalena Grove. And these are superb developments that remain satisfyingly intact. It's really extraordinary to have the degree of intactness in these works, and very rewarding. And we can explore the reasons for that later after the film. But Urambi and Wybalena are only two works out of a lifetime of significant projects that Michael has done, and his projects covered single residential, multi-residential, public buildings and educational projects. As a young man in 1955, Michael won a traineeship with the New South Wales Government Architects Office, and other members of that office were Peter Webber, who later became the Government Architect, Ken Woolley, who became partner at Anchor Mortlock and Woolley, Anchor Mortlock Murray and Woolley, and also Peter Hall, who later took over the Opera House from Jorgensen. So, no slouch in the company he kept. During his period with the Department of Public Works, Michael designed a number of schools, several of which were recognised in major awards. And later with Ken Woolley, Michael designed the first architectural project homes for Pettit and Sevitt. And Canberra has a number of examples of the Pettit and Sevitt low line. And I think if you look at Canberra Home website, you'll find a number of references to those houses. And there are also a number of project homes he designed for companies such as Aspect and Habitat, and they're mostly in Aranda, Canberra and Western. And later works included larger buildings such as, including Grosvenor Place in Sydney, which Michael jointly authored with Harry Seidler. And this building was awarded the highest accolade of the Silman Award in 1991. So it's now my pleasure to launch the world premiere of Michael Dysart, the movie.
It's a pretty hard act to follow, actually. Anyway, just try and give an overview of where the journey and how I got here in the first place. It is an interesting sort of sequence of events. But first of all, my thanks to DESIGN Canberra for the invitation, and particularly for the Institute of Architects, and Catherine can pass that on, rewarding the highest honour to Urambi and Wybalena. And to Tim Ross for his brilliant and insightful video. He captured it pretty succinctly, actually. So, but as for me, I've got a very fortunate life of being in the right place at the right time. And unlike my parents' generation, who lived through 2 world wars and a depression, the worst depression in human history. So my journey through cooperatives has been eventful, but it's certainly not life-threatening. But Tim asked me, when did I become an Australian? Which is an interesting question. It was probably a question that Dorothy McCulloch would have answered, because I have Irish, English and French blood running in my veins. But the question goes to the heart of my architect's response to an Australian identity. And I've come to love this Sunburn country, and I can think my architecture actually reflects that. But it's not always easy. In the 1950s, the arrival in Katoomba was a shock. It was about spectacular scenery, the rugged mountain ranges, the wild bush, twisted grey-green eucalypts, blackened tree trunks, banksia, bottle brush, and bendy eye underfoot. Brown snakes, trapdoor spiders was the last straw. It was all alien and threatening. But in 1957, I joined the Government Architects, and this guy's Harry Wimber. And Harry Italian, and I think as Catherine has mentioned, as a string of extraordinary architects, in fact, were my contemporaries and friends. But Harry was a breath of fresh air after a very extraordinary, no, I would say bad, but it was Anglophile university education at Sydney University. So it didn't give me much, but Harry was special, and he believed that buildings should be timeless, which is obvious, and that they should embody a sense of place, their siting, the natural materials, and native landscape. Now, Harry could have been describing the architectural philosophy of Wybalena or Urambi, and that's in 1958. Right? So, his own remarkable house in 1935, built of natural materials, unpainted and memorable, and I owe a huge debt to Harry's quiet and incisive design skills, and he was my mentor. But also, with my government architect, I had to travel, and I travelled throughout the state. Because as you probably know, every country town has a school, a town hall, a courthouse, a police station, all designed by the government architect. So the reach of the government architects is extraordinary from in those days anyway, from Green Bay right through to the farmer when I was there. But you're talking about the hills. Here's the and actually gave an extraordinary entree, if you like, to the Australian ethos. And so you're walking around country towns, you're seeing the atmosphere, you're actually picking up on the vernacular. And the vernacular was born of necessity, simple materials, economical solutions, and harmony with nature, and again on the veranda, and don't forget the Galan Roof, that's very important. Yes. Actually, that's the courthouse in Bathurst. So this is the high style of the government architect's thing, but also you have the vernacular as well, since I was more practitioner in some way. But I was, as a student, invited to some toilet additions to the courthouse. But at the same time, this is a house I did for a friend, and 1958, and again, Harry Wimber's mantra was there in this one, with the trees, the building, the use of materials, and the use of the sawn timber and treated naturally. So, and also I got a men's college at Armada, again the same idea again, the use of timbers, and again natural materials, the environment. That's the interior of the actual college itself. The basalt was lying around on the site, so it was obviously ready to be used, so I did it. And a school, for instance, and that was actually again using the materials, and you can see remnants of Wybalena and certainly Urambi. And then, but suddenly it was changing in the 1960s because Lend-Lease started a homes fair at Carlingford, and it was also associated with, I think it was Kerry Barker, his father. So it was a time of upsurge in interest in housing, interest in design. So it was a very optimistic time. And these were houses which we did, was Ken Lee and myself. We won a competition earlier on, so therefore we suddenly asked to do this exhibition village or help to. So we did 3 of the 20 houses that were on full exhibition. And that was an extraordinary exhibition because they had something like 2 million visitors to that little simple, wasn't simple, I suppose, 20 houses, but it catalysed, it became, it was a phenomenal kind of change in the direction of how people looked at buildings and thought about it. There's some of the houses that you can see, split levels. And then it moved on, then it became some of the other houses, such as the companies that were spawned from that development were people like Federal said, that Habitat, the program. And I designed houses for all 3 of those companies. And I suppose there would have been something like about 3,000 houses that would have been built to my design. And a lot of those were actually split levels. So they had the split level arrangements. And all the North Shore developments, which are actually very rocky and simple, difficult sites. And so, and the change in architecture, if you like, to respond to both the sites, but also the interior. Because you blew out you follow the roof line, like following the simple device selection, just following the roof line internally. So you created all these internal spaces, which are quite lovely. And that's a very simple kitchen, as you can see, kitchen family room, because that was the kind of standard we were doing. This is that would have been 1960, 65, I think. But then it gets on to the landscape, again, the use of the landscape, again, bringing landscape into the buildings. And this was a project village. So, and that was the extent. What I actually insisted was the surveyors would survey the trees, and we actually designed the house around the trees. And this house was 1960, maybe 64, I suppose. That was a little bit later. But this is interesting because you can see there the actual sloping roofs, and they bring the roof like the sunlight bringing into the thing. The sloping ceilings, the beams, and so you had this use of natural materials and the dynamic of the interior was fundamental to the architecture as well. That's an interesting little exercise, this one. We're having rather, I suppose, red wine evening with the builders, because actually we were very close. We actually worked very closely with the Habitat people. And over the red wine, we actually, it was a bet that we couldn't design and build a house, exhibition house, open for exhibition in 6 weeks. That's an extraordinary kind of bet. Now, around the dining table, we were all a bit drunk, but I actually designed the house. The construction manager was Jim White. He went off and he did the orders of all days over the phone. And we had the design manager. He was falling asleep on my drawing board. He's like the working drawings. And at 2 in the morning, he took the drawings away. So, because that's the Automobile Council approved those house in 1 day. But if you transgressed or followed the codes, BC codes, they would demolish the house. So it was a very simple formula. You had to deliver a house that was had passed the muster. And it was done in 6 weeks. So that's the kind of era in which we were living. I put this in here because that's Elizabeth MacArthur's house, 1820, and in Habitat, what I was trying to do was change the perception of Australian attitude to their own history. At that stage, there were people building fake Cape Cod houses in St. Ives, with steep sloping roofs to shed the snow, and with little peekaboo windows. So this is, I suppose, my attempt to say, there is a way of looking at life from a different lens. And so you can see the difference there, the two contrasts. So that was the one I did for Habitat. And so that's sort of one. So thank you, Elizabeth, for a house designed in 1820. I mean, can you imagine that? Extraordinary. No, anyway. But in the same company, I was trying to change attitudes. I also helped to write copy with the advertising people. Right? So, in other words, in this particular case, we said, look, designing for the Australian landscape. This is again in 1968, but, and I think I read here, it says every habitat house comes complete with a landscape plan and specification. Now, when does that ever happen? Extraordinary. But we changed the way people are looking at housing, and like another one is designed for Australian way of life. And I helped write the copy, which actually I was saying this is an artificial way of approaching, proselytizing that this is how life could be. And again, the evolution of relative habitat. You can see with that house, that's the start of Wybalena. And you see the actual texture of the house, and you see the fabric of it, how it works, and the arms reaching into the ground. So it becomes a very strong element in the landscape. We'll talk about that later. But I was going to have disillusioned with private housing because it wasn't going in the direction that I thought it was. The 10 square house, or let's say the 100 square metre house in 1960s became a 200 square metre house in 1970, and McMansion was on the way. And I thought it was very disgusting, and so I thought there must be a different way of doing things. So I guess what I did was approach theatre producer at Wells University, and so I got some of the staff to actually come with me, and we formed a cooperative called Barron Valley. And really it was 40 units were built in that building. And my fundamental premise was that you could do as a profit, 20% profit, which a builder or a developer normally has, that could be transferred back, of course, to the cooperatives, and we were saving money. Similarly with the white goods, there were big discounts on the white goods, and also people had a choice of what unit they wanted. So this was a way of looking at things. I put these people in because that's my friends and my team of people through a lot of those times. And Peter Bell, he'd be the third one from the left, and Peter is a great friend, has been with me for all those years, and that's 50 years of practice. So it says Michael Dysart, but in fact it's Michael Dysart and a lot of people who are supporting me and working with me, so it's a very rich and rewarding experience. And Peter actually came down and lived in Canberra for 2 years, building those two cooperatives. So we worked together very closely, and we were a great team. Urambi, as you can see, that's a golf course. It wasn't reserved. We didn't have a reserve then. I was concerned that we were going to build something right alongside it. But I'll go back to here because that's the plan, and that's interesting in itself because it's like an inverted L-shaped plan, if you like. At the top of the screen is the reserve. At the bottom of the screen, of course, the Crozier Circuit. And there's a regular development of Crowshot houses which runs along the development. But the problem I was facing was, how do you design a cooperative? There were no precedents really. So you've been standing on your own, you don't know quite what to do because in fact it doesn't exist. So I remember going to the professors of sociology at both universities and explaining my problem and saying this and saying how could you do, because I thought they could provide, if you like, an underlying kind of intellectual analysis of how it can work in terms of people interaction. So that's what I was looking for. How do you either A, make people interact, or how do you plan it? But the consensus, they came back and said, Michael, you build it and we'll tell you what's wrong with it. So I was pissed off at that, shit mine. Anyway, but the actual sort of, but in my experience though, in medium density it fails because you get a plethora of roads, driveways, and a main road through the centre that actually is based on the turning circle of a garbage truck. And that's how you design a medium density development. and a lot of developers you see in Canberra, Sydney and everywhere else, all obey these ridiculously stupid rules. So what I was trying to do was to change the method of doing things. So I guess that I relegated the cars to the street level. So as Tim was saying, so that was what I did to try and create this internal street. So, and that was, if you like, the development in essence. The sloping land from the street with the street levels, and the low-lying land on the crest of reserve was the courtyard house. So that was the kind of the analysis or the principle involved. So the centre became the central road. So again, you had the sort of courtyard houses, or in this case, it was at the end of the split levels, with the central garden to the centre. Now this is what we planned, or I planned, and to bring the cooperative along with you, and everyone agrees with this. Now, a lot of people disagreed, of course, and they wanted the garage next to the living room. I was trying to put it on the outside, you got green space through the centre, and it's child safety, all those issues. So, and that's what I was trying to do. But there were disagreements within the cooperative. There always are. Anyway, so those people left the cooperatives and did other things. So the ones that were remaining were actually very much in tune with what I was trying to do. Anyway, so we went to the audit process. The plans were all approved by the cooperative, submitted to the NCDC, and as Tim said in the interview, the NCDC rejected the plan outright, and which was extraordinary, really. The argument was, these are 72 of your citizens, and why are you doing this? And he said, oh, you're slum in 5 years, and so all the carry on. So in the end, you got Tommy Wren, who was the minister at the time, to overrule the NCDC. So we actually, otherwise I wouldn't be here tonight. In fact, it wasn't for Tommy Wren. So he overruled the NCDC, and we ended up building the Wren. And that gives you an idea of some of the courtyard housing. It's quite pretty the way it sits on there. Lots of pergolas. Again, sort of sophisticated sort of developments, or if you like, sort of variations on the courtyard houses. Extraordinary how many different variations there were. Courtyard houses are told as mankind, and whether they're Chinese or it's from Morocco. It's still one of the most basic kind of housing forms for public. And I never realised it until when you sit down and do plans with a number of people. But one of those courtyard houses is the same. They're all different plans. And this is what we're trying to do, is to give everybody like an opportunity to express themselves in their own home. Now then he killed us, because imagine how many drawings we had to do. Pretty stupid, really. But these are the kind of courtyards you end up with, which are quite lovely, but how they developed over time. And some are quite lovely and kind of and rustic, if you like. I don't mind whichever it is, because actually, again, it's people expressing themselves in their own spaces. And again, you've got quite sophisticated ones as well. But the most important thing and satisfying thing is that kind of central space, where it could have been a road, it could have been 72 driveways. You've got a lovely integrated landscape space. Not that complicated, really. But then we come to Wybalena, which is very, very interesting in itself. And I think I'm just trying to number of things into there. Wybalena was an interesting start, Wybalena. Because what happened was the public couple of trades as it was then, at the time that the Labor Party agreed to the legislation to change the unit titles so that it allowed the cooperatives to exist, they were quite innovative, because they had quite a number of cooperatives, small cooperatives, who wanted to interact. So we were asked to come down from Sydney and invited by the public co-operatives to address a public meeting in the old Canberra itself. And And the NCDC, or the NCDC, through the capital purchase, had subdivided the entire site into 5 groups, so A, B, C, D, E. So this is what they did. There wasn't much sensitivity in them. And so the 5 cooperatives were all wandering around what on earth to do next. So I ended up having to become a Mother Teresa to all these kind of groups. And it was very difficult actually. But, you know, it's sort of, it was sort of like my head was coffee. It was a very rocky start trying to coordinate 4 cooperatives with different philosophies. We had the evangelicals who wanted to build a small chapel on the hill. We had the engineers who wanted practical and economical housing now. We had a social group who wanted to write PhD papers on their interactive experiences. And we had a craft group who wanted a workshop, of course. So at that point in time, it was exacerbated by the fact we had time delays caused by the DCT regulations, the normal intervention, misunderstandings as to how to share the cost and the roads and services, and of course the members' individual financial contributions. But the enormity of the undertaking was just suddenly becoming too difficult, and the group started to implode, fade away, and look for alternatives. But there was a 5th group who loved the site, liked the idea of community, and appreciated our planning and architecture, which I liked. Could be continued, they were cooperative. Their spokesman was Ollie Herasian, and they became the nucleus and driving force, if you like, for Wybalena. But from a planning standpoint, I couldn't change the planning clusters as set out by the NPCT control document, and I was concerned about the housing groups again developing an us and them situation where they become separate and they become not competing but not cooperating. So that's a decision I took to make it a strong visual theme, if you like, to not control the site, but to actually sort of not dominate, but that there's a consistent architectural theme that ran through the entire development, so you wouldn't have these kind of us and them situations occurring. But I suppose that, again, it's sort of like we mentioned earlier, the Habitat Alloy House was in fact the starting point of a language, if you like, that I developed for that particular site. And there you can see the kind of larger sizes. This is but then there's a construction shot for various houses on the way through. So you get an idea of how the lines are extending beyond the houses and how the development actually works and how the individuals, there are spaces within the house where people can move through them. Everybody has their own kind of individual spaces, front and rear. And again, you get an idea of how the houses step and form and do things in that environment. And then we had a sort of almost the same sort of thing. We had the same thing. Sorry, the language again is evident, and how the houses developed within Wybalena, and they've been very successful, I think. And again, the pyramid form, as you can see, is a very strong pyramid form. The actual way it dances down the streets, and you've got an internal landscape area. Had you won the battle with the NCDC, we now have all these internal spaces within the cooperatives. Again, the house is integrated with the trees and the landscape become one. So it's possible to me anyway. It was actually sort of a very worthwhile exercise, and it's very heartening for me to look back now at these developments. And you see that's the internal spaces. It was actually looking back, because these entries, if you like, quite modest. They weren't expensive. The houses were reasonably accessible for people to afford. And the idea came on the mid-level, and you could walk up or down, obviously. The down level could be all bedrooms, or the upper level could be bedrooms. So you can swap and change and do things, variations within that. I think we've something like about 12 different designs with variations in those designs. The nice thing about it was that you do end up with extensive decks on the upper levels, so they're quite beautiful because you're in the treetops, much like you saw with those other habitat things where I was trying to extend the spaces or spatial interaction between nature and deck. Or at the ground level where the deck would extend beyond that. And you can see where the wall is sloping down, and that's about the extent of where your theoretical entitlement is. But I think that's elastic, and it's been cleverly done with developments, and so I'm very pleased with the way things have gone. And again, a similar kind of thing, you get that attention to detail, lovely kind of, again, I won't call it Mission Brown, but we certainly, back in the earlier days with Habitat, I did develop certain stains and oil pigments, which in fact could last since the time, and some of these are working. That's an interesting shot because this is a gap between two groups of houses, and it's quite delightful because you get paths that wander through the houses. And this gets back to my whole essence, I suppose. And I won't bore you with the kind of issue, but you know, it really has to do with space-time, which always intrigues me because when I read this little piece here, because they have it like this to something else. It's I've always had a fixation with this time, space, time, and movement. But both cooperative incorporate these intangible elements because they are intangible. You can't pin these things down and say this is an absolute. It's always changing. That the inner space and permeability has been a recurring theme in many of my building. It can take on many guises and functions, active, passive. It can also be seen in the spatial transition. And I've used it as an organisational device, breaking down scale, allowing small spaces to flow into larger ones, from light into dark, compression to expansion, emphasising the dynamics of human movement through space. Now, these qualities of light, change of levels, are evident in both cooperatives, and it's the spatial interaction which I think is it's intangible. You try and create it, but you don't know whether it's going to work. And in the case of both these cooperatives, I think that's one of the most satisfying things that I'm concerned, because they have worked. But it is hard to pin that down. And so I think that's all we have to say.